rise to the astral plane, he leaves his Kama-rupa behind him. If he has purged himself from all earthly desires during life, and directed all his energies into the channels of unselfish spiritual aspiration, his higher ego will be able to draw back into itself the whole of the lower manas which it put forth into incarnation. In that case, the Kama-rupa left behind on the astral plane will be a mere corpse, like the abandoned physical body, and it will then come not into this class, but into the next. Even in the case of a man of somewhat less perfect life, almost the same result may be attained, if the forces of lower desire are allowed to work themselves out undisturbed in Kama-loka. But the majority of mankind make but very trifling and perfunctory efforts while on earth to rid themselves of the less elevated impulses of their nature, and consequently doom themselves not only to a greatly prolonged sojourn on the astral plane, but also to what cannot be described otherwise than as a loss of a portion of the lower manas. This is no doubt a very material method of expressing the great mystery of the reflection of the higher manas in the lower, but since only those who have passed the portals of initiation can fully comprehend this, we must content ourselves with the nearest approximation to exactitude which is possible to us, and as a matter of fact, a very fairly accurate idea of what actually takes place will be obtained by adopting the hypothesis that the manasic principle sends down a portion of itself into the lower world of physical life at each incarnation, and expects to be able to withdraw it again at the end of the life, enriched by all its varied experiences. The ordinary man, however, usually allows himself to be so pitiably enslaved by all sorts of base desires that a certain portion of this lower manas becomes very closely interwoven with karma, and when the separation takes place, his life in Kama-loka being over, the manasic principle has, as it were, to be torn apart, the degraded portion remaining within the Kama-rupa. This Kama-rupa, then, consists of the particles of astral matter from which the lower manas has not been able to disengage itself, and which therefore retain it captive. For when manas passes into devachan, these clinging fragments adhere to a portion of it, and as it were wrench it away. The proportion of the matter of each level present in the Kama-rupa will therefore depend on the extent to which manas has become inextricably entangled with the lower passions. It will be obvious that as manas in passing from level to level is unable to free itself completely from the matter of each, the Kama-rupa will show the presence of each grosser kind which has succeeded in retaining its connection with it. Thus comes into existence the class of entity which has been called the shade, an entity, be it observed, which is not in any sense the real individual at all, for he has passed away into devachan, but nevertheless not only bears his exact personal appearance, but possesses his memory and all his little idiosyncrasies, and may therefore very readily personate him, as indeed it frequently does at seances. It is not, of course, conscious of any act of impersonation, for as far as its intellect goes, it must necessarily suppose itself to be the individual, but one can imagine the horror and disgust of the friends of the departed if they could only realize that they had been deceived into accepting as their loved one a mere soulless bundle of all his worst qualities. Its length of life varies according to the amount of the lower manas which animates it, but as this is all the while in the process of fading out, its intellect is a steadily diminishing quantity, though it may possess a great deal of a certain sort of animal cunning, and even quite towards the end of its career it is still able to communicate by borrowing temporary intelligence from the medium. From its very nature it is exceedingly liable to be swayed by all kinds of evil influences, and, having separated from its higher ego, it has nothing in its constitution capable of responding to good ones. It therefore lends itself readily to various minor purposes of some of the baser sort of black magicians. So much of the matter of the manasic nature as it possesses gradually disintegrates and returns to its own plane, though not to any individual mind, and thus the shade fades by almost imperceptible gradations into a member of our next class. 5. The shell. This is absolutely the mere astral corpse in process of disintegration, every particle of the lower manas having left it. It is entirely without any kind of consciousness or intelligence, and is drifted passively about upon the astral currents, just as a cloud might be swept in any direction by a passing breeze. But even yet it may be galvanized for a few moments into a ghastly burlesque of life, if it happens to come within reach of a medium's aura. Under such circumstances it will still exactly resemble its departed personality in appearance, and may even reproduce to some extent his familiar expressions or handwriting, but it does so merely by the automatic action of the cells of which it is composed, which tend under stimulation to repeat the form of action to which they are most accustomed, and whatever amount of intelligence may lay behind any such manifestation has most assuredly no connection with the original entity, but is lent by the medium or his guides for the occasion. It is, however, more frequently temporarily vitalized in quite another manner, which will be described under the next head. It has also the quality of being still blindly responsive to such vibrations, usually of the lowest order, as were frequently set up in it during its last stage of existence as a shade, and consequently persons in whom evil desires or passions are predominant will be very likely, when they attend physical seances, to find these intensified, and as it were thrown back upon them by the unconscious shells. There is also another variety of corpse which it is necessary to mention under this head, though it belongs to a much earlier stage of man's post-mortem history. It has been stated above that after the death of the physical body, the Kama-rupa is comparatively quickly formed, and the etheric double cast off, this latter body being destined to slow disintegration, precisely as is the Kama-rupic shell at a later stage of the proceedings. This etheric shell, however, is not to be met with drifting aimlessly about, as is the variety with which we have hitherto been dealing. On the contrary, it remains within a few yards of the decaying physical body, and since it is readily visible to anyone even slightly sensitive, it is accountable for many of the commonly current stories of churchyard ghosts. A psychically developed person passing one of our great cemeteries will see hundreds of these bluish-white, misty forms hovering over the graves where are laid the physical vestures which they have recently left, and as they, like their lower counterparts, are in various stages of disintegration, the sight is by no means a pleasant one. This also, like the other kind of shell, is entirely devoid of consciousness and intelligence, and though it may under certain circumstances be galvanized into a very horrible form of temporary life, this is possible only by means of some of the most loathsome rites of one of the worst forms of black magic, about which the less said the better. It will thus be seen that in the successive stages of his progress from earth life to Devachan, man casts off and leaves to slow disintegration no less than 3 corpses: the physical body, the etheric double, and the Kama-rupa, all of which are by degrees resolved into their constituent elements and utilized anew on their respective planes by the wonderful chemistry of nature. 6. The vitalized shell. This entity ought not, strictly speaking, to be classified under the head human at all, since it is only its outer vesture, the passive, senseless shell, that was once an appanage of humanity. Such life, intelligence, desire, and will as it may possess are those of the artificial elemental animating it, and that, though in terrible truth a creation of man's evil thought, is not itself human. It will therefore perhaps be better to deal with it more fully under its appropriate class among the artificial entities, as its nature and genesis will be more readily comprehensible by the time that part of our subject is reached. Let it suffice here to mention that it is always a malevolent being, a true tempting demon, whose evil influence is limited only by the extent of its power. Like the shade, it is frequently used to further the horrible purposes of the voodoo and obeah forms of magic. Some writers have spoken of it under the name elementary, but as that title has, at one time or other, been used for almost every variety of post-mortem entity, it has become so vague and meaningless that it is perhaps better to avoid it. 7. The suicide or victim of sudden death. It will be readily understood that a man who is torn from physical life hurriedly while in full health and strength, whether by accident or suicide, finds himself upon the astral plane under conditions differing considerably from those which surround one who dies either from old age or from disease. In the latter case, the hold of earthly desires upon the entity is more or less weakened, and probably the very grossest particles are already got rid of, so that the Kama-rupa will most likely form itself on the 6th or 5th subdivision of the Kama-loka, or perhaps even higher. The principles have been gradually prepared for separation, and the shock is therefore not so great. In the case of the accidental death or suicide, none of these preparations have taken place, and the withdrawal of the principles from their physical encasement has been very aptly compared to the tearing of the stone out of an unripe fruit. A great deal of the grossest kind of astral matter still clings around the personality, which is consequently held in the 7th or lowest subdivision of the Kama-loka. This has already been described as anything but a pleasant abiding place, yet it is by no means the same for all those who are compelled for a time to inhabit it. The victims of sudden death, whose earth lives have been pure and noble, have no affinity for this plane, and the time of their sojourn upon it is passed, to quote from an early letter on this subject, either in happy ignorance and full oblivion, or in a state of quiet slumber, a sleep full of rosy dreams. But on the other hand, if their earth lives have been low and brutal, selfish and sensual, they will, like the suicides, be conscious to the fullest extent in this undesirable region, and they are liable to develop into terribly evil entities, inflamed with all kinds of horrible appetites which they can no longer satisfy directly now they are without a physical body. They gratify their loathsome passions vicariously through a medium or any sensitive person whom they can obsess, and they take a devilish delight in using all the arts of delusion which the astral plane puts in their power, in order to lead others into the same excesses which have proved so fatal to themselves. Quoting again from the same letter, these are the pisachas, the incubi and succubi of medieval writers, demons of thirst and gluttony, of lust and avarice, of intensified craft, wickedness and cruelty, provoking their victims to horrible crimes, and revelling in their commission. From this class and the last are drawn the tempters, the devils of ecclesiastical literature, but their power fails utterly before purity of mind and purpose. They can do nothing with a man unless he has first encouraged in himself the vices into which they seek to draw him. One whose psychic sight has been opened will often see crowds of these unfortunate creatures hanging round butchers' shops, public houses, or other even more disreputable places, wherever the gross influences in which they delight are to be found, and where they encounter men and women still in the flesh who are like-minded with themselves. For such an entity as one of these to meet with a medium with whom he is in affinity is indeed a terrible misfortune. Not only does it enable him to prolong enormously his dreadful life in Kama-loka, but it renews for perhaps an indefinite period his power to generate evil karma, and so prepare for himself a future incarnation of the most degraded character, besides running the risk of losing a large portion or even the whole of the lower manas. On this lowest level of the astral plane he must stay at least as long as his earthly life would have lasted if it had not been prematurely cut short. And if he is fortunate enough not to meet with a sensitive through whom his passions can be vicariously gratified, the unfulfilled desires will gradually burn themselves out, and the suffering caused in the process will probably go far towards working off the evil karma of the past life. The position of the suicide is further complicated by the fact that his rash act has enormously diminished the power of the higher ego to withdraw its lower portion into itself, and therefore has exposed him to manifold and great additional dangers. But it must be remembered that the guilt of suicide differs considerably, according to its circumstances, from the morally blameless act of Seneca or Socrates, through all degrees down to the heinous crime of the wretch who takes his own life in order to escape from the entanglements into which his villainy has brought him, and of course the position after death varies accordingly. It should be noted that this class, as well as the shades and the vitalized shells, are all what may be called minor vampires. That is to say, whenever they have the opportunity, they prolong their existence by draining away the vitality from human beings whom they find themselves able to influence. This is why both medium and sitters are often so weak and exhausted after a physical séance. A student of occultism is taught how to guard himself from their attempts, but without that knowledge it is difficult for one who puts himself in their way to avoid being more or less laid under contribution by them.
8. The Vampire and Werewolf. There remain two even more awful but happily very rare possibilities to be mentioned before this part of our subject is completed, and though they differ very widely in many ways, we may yet perhaps group them together, since they have in common the qualities of unearthly horror and of extreme rarity, the latter arising from the fact that they are really relics of earlier races. We of the fifth root race ought to have evolved beyond the possibility of meeting such a ghastly fate as is indicated by either of the two headings of this subsection, and we have so nearly done it that these creatures are commonly regarded as mere medieval fables. Yet there are examples to be found occasionally even now, though chiefly in countries where there is a considerable strain of fourth race blood, such as Russia or Hungary. The popular legends about them are probably often considerably exaggerated, but there is nevertheless a terribly serious substratum of truth beneath the eerie stories which pass from mouth to mouth among the peasantry of Central Europe. The general characteristics of such tales are too well known to need more than a passing reference. A fairly typical specimen of the vampire story, though it does not profess to be more than the merest fiction, is Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, while a very remarkable account of an unusual form of this creature is to be found in Isis Unveiled, Volume 1, page 454. All readers of theosophical literature are familiar with the idea that it is possible for a man to live a life so absolutely degraded and selfish, so utterly wicked and brutal, that the whole of his lower manas may become entirely enmeshed in karma, and finally separated from its spiritual source in the higher ego. Some students even seem to think that such an occurrence is quite a common one, and that we may meet scores of such soulless men, as they have been called, in the street every day of our lives. But this, happily, is untrue. To attain the appalling preeminence in evil, which thus involves the entire loss of a personality and the weakening of the developing individuality behind, a man must stifle every gleam of unselfishness or spirituality, and must have absolutely no redeeming point whatever. And when we remember how often, even in the worst of villains, there is to be found something not wholly bad, we shall realize that the abandoned personalities must always be a very small minority. Still, comparatively few though they be, they do exist, and it is from their ranks that the still rarer vampire is drawn. The lost entity would very soon after death find himself unable to stay in Kamaloka, and would be irresistibly drawn in full consciousness into his own place, the mysterious eighth sphere, there slowly to disintegrate after experiences best left undescribed. If, however, he perishes by suicide or sudden death, he may, under certain circumstances, especially if he knows something of black magic, hold himself back from that awful fate by a death in life scarcely less awful, the ghastly existence of the vampire. Since the eighth sphere cannot claim him until after the death of the body, he preserves it in a kind of cataleptic trance by the horrible expedient of the transfusion into it of blood drawn from other human beings by his semi-materialized Kamarupa, and thus postpones his final destiny by the commission of wholesale murder. As popular superstition again quite rightly supposes, the easiest and most effectual remedy in such a case is to exhume and burn the body, thus depriving the creature of his point d'appui. When the grave is opened, the body usually appears quite fresh and healthy, and the coffin is not infrequently filled with blood. Of course, in countries where cremation is the custom, vampirism of this sort is impossible. The werewolf, though equally horrible, is the product of a somewhat different karma, and indeed ought perhaps to have found a place under the first instead of the second division of the human inhabitants of Kamaloka, since it is always during a man's lifetime that he first manifests under this form. It invariably implies some knowledge of magical arts, sufficient at any rate to be able to project the astral body. When a perfectly cruel and brutal man does this, there are certain circumstances under which the body may be seized upon by other astral entities and materialized, not into the human form, but into that of some wild animal, usually the wolf, and in that condition it will range the surrounding country, killing other animals, and even human beings, thus satisfying not only its own craving for blood, but that of the fiends who drive it on. In this case, as so often with the ordinary astral body, any wound inflicted upon the animal materialization will be reproduced upon the human physical body by the extraordinary phenomenon of repercussion, though after the date of that physical body, the Kamarupa, which will probably continue to appear in the same form, will be less vulnerable. It will then, however, be also less dangerous, as unless it can find a suitable medium, it will be unable to materialize fully. It has been the fashion of this century to scoff at what are called the foolish superstitions of the ignorant peasantry, but as in the above cases, so in many others, the occult student finds on careful examination that obscure or forgotten truths of nature lie behind what at first sight appears mere nonsense, and he learns to be cautious in rejecting as well as cautious in accepting. Intending explorers of the astral plane need have little fear of encountering the very unpleasant creatures described under this head, for as before stated, they are even now extremely rare, and as time goes on, their number will happily steadily diminish. In any case, their manifestations are usually restricted to the immediate neighbourhood of their physical bodies, as might be supposed from their extremely material nature. The black magician or his pupil. This person corresponds at the other extremity of the scale to our second class of departed entities, the chela awaiting reincarnation. But in this case, instead of obtaining permission to adopt an unusual method of progress, the man is defying the natural process of evolution by maintaining himself in Kamaloka by magical arts, sometimes of the most horrible nature. It would be easy to make various subdivisions of this class according to their objects, their methods, and the possible duration of their existence on this plane. But as they are by no means fascinating objects of study, and all that an occult student wishes to know about them is how to avoid them, it will probably be more interesting to pass on to the examination of another part of our subject. It may, however, be just mentioned that every such human entity which prolongs its life thus on the astral plane beyond its natural limit, invariably does so at the expense of others, and by the absorption of their life in some form or another. End of Part 3.
Part 4 of The Astral Plane by C.W. Ledbetter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Inhabitants continued. 2. Non-human. Though it might have been thought fairly obvious, even to the most casual glance, that many of the terrestrial arrangements of nature which affect us most nearly have not been designed exclusively with a view to our comfort, or even our ultimate advantage, it was yet probably unavoidable that the human race, at least in its childhood, should imagine that this world and everything it contains existed solely for its own use and benefit. Undoubtedly, we ought by this time to have grown out of that infantile delusion, and realized our proper position and the duties that attach to it. That most of us have not yet done so is shown in a dozen ways in our daily life, notably by the atrocious cruelty habitually displayed towards the animal kingdom under the name of sport by many who probably consider themselves highly civilized people. Of course, the veriest tyro in the holy science of occultism knows that all life is sacred, and that without universal compassion there is no true progress. But it is only as he advances in his studies that he discovers how manifold evolution is, and how comparatively small a place humanity really fills in the economy of nature. It becomes clear to him that just as earth, air and water support myriads of forms of life, which, though invisible to the ordinary eye, are revealed to us by the microscope, so the higher planes connected with our earth have an equally dense population of whose existence we are ordinarily completely unconscious. As his knowledge increases, he becomes more and more certain that in one way or another the utmost use is being made of every possibility of evolution, and that wherever it seems to us that in nature force or opportunity is being wasted or neglected, it is not the scheme of the universe that is in fault, but our ignorance of its method and intention. For the purposes of our present consideration of the non-human inhabitants of the astral plane, it will be best to leave out of consideration those very early forms of the universal life which are evolving in a manner of which we can have little comprehension through the successive encasement of atoms, molecules, and cells. For if we commence at the lowest of what are usually called the elemental kingdoms, we shall even then have to group together under this general heading an enormous number of inhabitants of the astral plane, upon whom it will be possible to touch only very slightly, as anything like a detailed account of them would swell this manual to the dimensions of an encyclopedia. The most convenient method of arranging the non-human entities will perhaps be in 4 classes, it being understood that in this case the class is not, as previously, a comparatively small subdivision, but usually a great kingdom of nature, at least as large and varied as, say, the animal or vegetable kingdom. Some of these rank considerably below humanity, some are our equals, and others again rise far above us in goodness and power. Some belong to our scheme of evolution, that is to say, they either have been or will be men like ourselves. Others are evolving on entirely distinct lines of their own. Before proceeding to consider them, it is necessary, in order to avoid the charge of incompleteness, to mention that in this branch of the subject 2 reservations have been made. First, no reference is made to the occasional appearances of very high adepts from other planets of the solar system, and of even more august visitors from a still greater distance, since such matters cannot fitly be described in an essay for general reading. And besides, it is practically inconceivable, though of course theoretically possible, that such glorified beings should ever need to manifest themselves on a plane so low as the astral. If for any reason they should wish to do so, the body appropriate to the plane would be temporarily created out of astral matter belonging to this planet, just as in the case of the Nirmanakaya. Secondly, quite outside of and entirely unconnected with the 4 classes into which we are dividing this section, there are 2 other great evolutions which at present share the use of this planet with humanity, but about them it is forbidden to give any particulars at this stage of the proceedings, as it is not apparently intended under ordinary circumstances either that they should be conscious of man's existence, or man of theirs. If we ever do come into contact with them, it will most probably be on the purely physical plane, for in any case their connection with our astral plane is of the slightest, since the only possibility of their appearance there depends upon an extremely improbable accident in an act of ceremonial magic, which fortunately only a few of the most advanced sorcerers know how to perform. Nevertheless, that improbable accident has happened at least once, and may happen again, so that, but for the prohibition above mentioned, it would have been necessary to include them in our list. 1. The elemental essence belonging to our own evolution. Just as the name elementary has been given indiscriminately by various writers to any or all of man's possible post-mortem conditions, so this word elemental has been used at various times to mean any or all non-human spirits, from the most godlike of the devas, down through every variety of nature spirit, to the formless essence which pervades the kingdoms lying beyond the mineral, until, after reading several books, the student becomes absolutely bewildered by the contradictory statements made on the subject. For the purposes of this treatise, it will perhaps simplify matters to restrict its meaning to the last mentioned class only, and use it to denote the three great kingdoms which precede the mineral in the order of our evolution. It may be remembered that in one of the earlier letters from an adept teacher, these elemental kingdoms are referred to, and the statement is made that the first and second cannot readily be comprehended except by an initiate. Fortunately this, the most incomprehensible part of the vast subject, does not come within the province of this manual, as those first and second elemental kingdoms exist and function respectively upon the Arupa and Arupa levels of the Devachanic plane. We have consequently to deal for the moment only with kingdom number 3, the one next before the mineral, though even that will be found to be quite sufficiently complicated, as will be understood when it is stated that it contains just over 2,400 perfectly distinct varieties of elemental essence, each of which the pupil who wishes to attain perfect control of the astral forces must learn not only to distinguish instantly at sight, but to deal with in its own special method and no other. Of course, phenomena of various sorts may be, and constantly are, produced by those who are able to wield only one or two of these forces, but the adept prefers to take the additional trouble requisite to understand all of them thoroughly, and uses in every case precisely the most appropriate force or combination of forces, so that his object may be attained with scientific accuracy and with the least possible expenditure of energy. To speak, as we so often do, of an elemental, in connection with the group we are now considering, is somewhat misleading, for strictly speaking there is no such thing. What we find is a vast store of elemental essence, wonderfully sensitive to the most fleeting human thought, responding with inconceivable delicacy in an infinitesimal fraction of a second, to a vibration set up in it, even by an entirely unconscious exercise of human will or desire. But the moment that, by the influence of such thought or exercise of will, it is moulded into a living force, into something that may correctly be described as an elemental, it at once ceases to belong to the category we are discussing, and becomes a member of the artificial class. Even then, its separate existence is usually of the most evanescent character, and as soon as its impulse has worked itself out, it sinks back into the undifferentiated mass of that particular subdivision of elemental essence from which it came. It would be tedious to attempt to catalogue these subdivisions, and indeed, even if a list of them were made, it would be unintelligible, except to the practical student who can call them up before him and compare them. Some idea of the leading lines of classification can, however, be grasped without much trouble, and may prove of interest. First comes the broad division which has given the elementals their name, the classification according to the kind of matter which they inhabit. Here, as usual, the septenary character of our evolution shows itself, for there are 7 such chief groups, related respectively to the 7 states of physical matter, to earth, water, air and fire, or to translate from medieval symbolism to modern accuracy of expression, to the solid, liquid, gaseous and etheric conditions. It has long been the custom to pity and despise the ignorance of the alchemists of the Middle Ages, because they gave the title of elements to substances which modern chemistry has discovered to be compounds. But in speaking of them thus slightingly, we have done them great injustice, for their knowledge on this subject was really wider, not narrower, than ours. They may or may not have catalogued all the 60 or 70 substances which we now call elements, but they certainly did not apply that name to them, for their occult studies had taught them that in that sense of the word there was but one element, Akasha itself, of which these and all other forms of matter were but modifications, a truth which some of the greatest chemists of the present day are just beginning to suspect. The fact is that in this particular case our despised forefathers' analysis went several steps deeper than our own. They understood and were able to observe the ether, which modern science can only postulate as a necessity for its theories. They were aware that it consists of physical matter in 4 entirely distinct states above the gaseous, a fact which has not yet been rediscovered. They knew that all physical objects consisted of matter in one or other of these 7 states, and that into the composition of every organic body all 7 entered in a greater or lesser degree. Hence all their talk of fiery and watery humours, or elements, which seems so grotesque to us. It is obvious that they used the latter word simply as a synonym for constituent parts, without in the least degree intending it to connote the idea of substances which could not be further reduced. They knew also that each of these orders of matter served as an upadhi, or basis of manifestation for a great class of evolving monadic essence, and so they christened the essence elemental. What we have to try to realize then is that in every particle of solid matter, so long as it remains in that condition, there resides, to use the picturesque phraseology of medieval students, an earth elemental, that is, a certain amount of the living elemental essence appropriate to it, while equally in every particle of matter in the liquid, gaseous or etheric states, the water, air and fire elementals respectively inhere. It will be observed that this first broad division of the third of the elemental kingdoms is, so to speak, a horizontal one. That is to say, its respective classes stand in the relation of steps, each somewhat less material than the one below it, which ascends into it by almost imperceptible degrees, and it is easy to understand how each of these classes may again be divided horizontally into 7, since there are obviously many degrees of density among solids, liquids and gases. There is, however, what may be described as a perpendicular division also, and this is somewhat more difficult to comprehend, especially as great reserve is always maintained by occultists as to some of the facts which would be involved in a fuller explanation of it. Perhaps the clearest way to put what is permissible to say on the subject will be to state that in each of the horizontal classes and subclasses will be found 7 perfectly distinct types of elemental, the difference between them being no longer a question of degree of materiality, but rather of character and affinities. Each of these types so reacts upon the others that, though it is impossible for them ever to interchange their essence, in each of them 7 subtypes will be found to exist, distinguished by the colouring given to their original peculiarity by the influence which sways them most readily. It will at once be seen that this perpendicular division and subdivision differs entirely in its character from the horizontal, in that it is far more permanent and fundamental. For while it is the evolution of the elemental kingdom to pass with almost infinite slowness through its various horizontal classes and subclasses in succession, and thus to belong to them all in turn, this is not so with regard to the types and subtypes, which remain unchangeable all the way through. A point which must never be lost sight of in endeavouring to understand this elemental evolution is that it is taking place on what is sometimes called the downward curve of the arc. That is to say, it is progressing towards the complete entanglement in matter which we witness in the mineral kingdom, instead of away from it, as is most other evolution of which we know anything, and this fact sometimes gives it a curiously inverted appearance in our eyes, until we thoroughly grasp its object. In spite of these manifold subdivisions, there are certain properties which are possessed in common by all varieties of this strange living essence, But even these are so entirely different from any with which we are familiar on the physical plane, that it is exceedingly difficult to explain them to those who cannot themselves see it in action. Let it be premised, then, that when any portion of this essence remains for a few moments entirely unaffected by any outside influence, a condition, by the way, which is hardly ever realized, it is absolutely without any definite form of its own, though even then its motion is rapid and ceaseless. But on the slightest disturbance, set up perhaps by some passing thought current, it flashes into a bewildering confusion of restless, ever-changing shapes, which form, rush about, and disappear with the rapidity of the bubbles on the surface of boiling water. These evanescent shapes, though generally those of living creatures of some sort, human or otherwise, no more express the existence of separate entities in the essence than do the equally changeful and multiform waves raised in a few moments on a previously smooth lake by a sudden squall. They seem to be mere reflections from the vast storehouse of the astral light, yet they have usually a certain appropriateness to the character of the thought stream which calls them into existence, though nearly always with some grotesque distortion, some terrifying or unpleasant aspect about them. A question naturally arises in the mind here as to what intelligence it is that is exerted in the selection of an appropriate shape or its distortion when selected. We are not dealing with the more powerful and longer-lived artificial elemental created by a strong definite thought, but simply with the results produced by the stream of half-conscious involuntary thoughts which the majority of mankind allow to flow idly through their brains, so that the intelligence is obviously not derived from the mind of the thinker, and we certainly cannot credit the elemental essence itself, which belongs to a kingdom further from individualization even than the mineral, with any sort of awakening of the manasic quality. Yet it does possess a marvellous adaptability, which often seems to come very near it, and it is no doubt this property that caused elementals to be described in one of our early books as the semi-intelligent creatures of the astral light. We shall find further evidence of this power when we come to consider the case of the artificial class. When we read of a good or evil elemental, it must always be either an artificial entity or one of the many varieties of nature spirits that is meant, for the elemental kingdoms proper do not admit of any such conceptions as good and evil, though there is undoubtedly a sort of bias or tendency permeating nearly all their subdivisions, which operates to render them rather hostile than friendly towards man, as every neophyte knows, for in most cases his very first impression of the astral plane is of the presence all around him of vast hosts of protean spectres, who advance upon him in threatening guise, but always retire or dissipate harmlessly if boldly faced. It is to this curious tendency that the distorted or unpleasant aspect above mentioned must be referred, and medieval writers tell us that man has only himself to thank for its existence. In the golden age before this, Kali Yuga men were on the whole less selfish and more spiritual, and then the elementals were friendly, though now they are no longer so because of man's indifference to, and want of sympathy with, other living beings. From the wonderful delicacy with which the essence responds to the faintest action of our minds or desires, it seems clear that this elemental kingdom as a whole is very much what the collective thought of humanity makes it. Anyone who will think for a moment how far from elevating the action of that collective thought is likely to be at the present time, will see little reason to wonder that we reap as we have sown, and that this essence, which has no power of perception, but only blindly receives and reflects what is projected upon it, should usually exhibit unfriendly characteristics. There can be no doubt that in later races or rounds, when mankind as a whole has evolved to a much higher level, the elemental kingdoms will be influenced by the changed thought which continually impinges upon them, and we shall find them no longer hostile but docile and helpful, as we are told that the animal kingdom will also be. Whatever may have happened in the past, it is evident that we may look forward to a very passable golden age in the future, if we can arrive at a time when the majority of men will be noble and unselfish, and the forces of nature will cooperate willingly with them. The fact that we are so readily able to influence the elemental kingdoms at once shows us that we have a responsibility towards them for the manner in which we use that influence. Indeed, when we consider the conditions under which they exist, it is obvious that the effect produced upon them by the thoughts and desires of all intelligent creatures inhabiting the same world with them must have been calculated upon in the scheme of our system as a factor in their evolution. In spite of the consistent teaching of all the great religions, the mass of mankind is still utterly regardless of its responsibility on the thought plane. If a man can flatter himself that his words and deeds have been harmless to others, he believes that he has done all that can be required of him, quite oblivious of the fact that he may for years have been exercising a narrowing and debasing influence on the minds of those about him, and filling surrounding space with the unlovely creations of a sordid mind. A still more serious aspect of this question will come before us when we discuss the artificial elemental, but in regard to the essence, it will be sufficient to state that we undoubtedly have the power to accelerate or delay its evolution, according to the use which consciously or unconsciously we are continually making of it. It would be hopeless within the limits of such a treatise as this to attempt to explain the different uses to which the forces inherent in the manifold varieties of this elemental essence can be put by one who has been trained in their management. The vast majority of magical ceremonies depend almost entirely upon its manipulation, either directly by the will of the magician or by some more definite astral entity evoked by him for that purpose. By its means, nearly all the physical phenomena of the séance room are produced, and it is also the agent in most cases of stone throwing or bell ringing in haunted houses, such results as these latter being brought about either by blundering efforts to attract attention made by some earthbound human entity, or by the mere mischievous pranks of some of the minor nature spirits belonging to our third class. But the elemental must never be thought of as itself a prime mover. It is simply a latent force which needs an external power to set it in motion. It may be noted that although all classes of the essence have the power of reflecting images from the astral light, as described above, there are varieties which receive certain impressions much more readily than others, which have, as it were, favourite forms of their own, into which, upon disturbance, they would naturally flow, unless absolutely forced into some other, and such shapes tend to be a trifle less evanescent than usual. Before leaving this branch of the subject, it may be well to warn the student against the confusion of thought into which some have fallen, through failing to distinguish this elemental essence which we have been considering, from the monadic essence, manifesting through the mineral kingdom. It must be borne in mind the monadic essence, at one stage of its evolution towards humanity, manifests through the elemental kingdom, while at a later stage it manifests through the mineral kingdom, but the fact that two bodies of monadic essence at these different stages are in manifestation at the same moment, and that one of these manifestations, the earth elemental, occupies the same space as, and inhabits the other, say a rock, in no way interferes with the evolution either of one or the other, nor does it imply any relation between the bodies of monadic essence lying within both. The rock will also be permeated by its appropriate variety of the omnipresent jiva, or life principle, but that of course is again totally distinct from either of the essences above mentioned. The Kama-rupas of animals. This is an extremely large class, yet it does not occupy a particularly important position on the astral plane, since its members usually stay there but a very short time. The vast majority of animals have not as yet acquired permanent individualization, and when one of them dies, the monadic essence which has been manifesting through it flows back again into the particular stratum whence it came, bearing with it such advancement or experience as has been attained during that life. It is not, however, able to do this quite immediately. The karmic aura of the animal forms itself into a Kama-rupa, just as in man's case, and the animal has a real existence on the astral plane. the length of which, though never great, varies according to the intelligence which it has developed. In most cases it does not seem to be more than dreamily conscious, but appears perfectly happy. The comparatively few domestic animals who have already attained individuality, and will therefore be reborn no more as animals in this world, have a much longer and much more vivid life in Kamaloka than their less advanced fellows, and at the end of it sink gradually into a subjective condition which is likely to last for a very considerable period. One interesting subdivision of this class consists of the Kama-rupas of those anthropoid apes mentioned in The Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, page 184, who are already individualized, and will be ready to take human incarnation in the next round, or perhaps some of them even sooner. 3. Nature spirits of all kinds. So many and so varied are the subdivisions of this class, that to do them anything like justice, one would need to devote a separate treatise to this subject alone. Some characteristics, however, they all have in common, and it will be sufficient here to try to give some idea of those. To begin with, we have to realize that we are here dealing with entities which differ radically from all that we have hitherto considered. Though we may rightly classify the elemental essence and the animal Kama-rupa as non-human, the monadic essence which manifests itself through them will, nevertheless, in the fullness of time, evolve to the level of manifesting itself through some future humanity comparable to our own. And if we were able to look back through countless ages on our own evolution in previous manvantaras, we should find that which is now ourselves has passed on its upward path through similar stages. That, however, is not the case with the vast kingdom of nature spirits. They neither have been, nor ever will be, members of a humanity such as ours. Their line of evolution is entirely different, and their only connection with us consists in our temporary occupancy of the same planet. Of course, since we are neighbours for the time being, we owe neighbourly kindness to one another when we happen to meet, but our lines of development differ so widely that each can do but little for the other. Many writers have included these spirits among the elementals, and indeed they are the elementals, or perhaps, to speak more accurately, the animals of a higher evolution. Though much more highly developed than our elemental essence, they have yet certain characteristics in common with it. For example, they also are divided into 7 great classes, inhabiting respectively the same 7 states of matter already mentioned as permeated by the corresponding varieties of the essence. Thus, to take those which are most readily comprehensible to us, there are spirits of the earth, water, air, and fire, or ether, definite intelligent astral entities residing and functioning in each of those media. It may be asked how it is possible for any kind of creature to inhabit the solid substance of a rock or of the crust of the earth. The answer is that since the nature spirits are formed of astral matter, the substance of the rock is no hindrance to their motion or their vision, and furthermore, physical matter in its solid state is their natural element, the only one to which they are accustomed and in which they feel at home. The same is of course true of those who live in water, air, or ether. In medieval literature, these earth spirits are often called gnomes, while the water spirits are spoken of as undines, the air spirits as sylphs, and the ether spirits as salamanders. In popular language they are known by many names: fairies, pixies, elves, brownies, peris, jinns, trolls, satyrs, fauns, kobolds, imps, goblins, good people, etc., some of these titles being applied only to one variety, and others indiscriminately to all. Their forms are many and various, but most frequently human in shape and somewhat diminutive in size. Like almost all inhabitants of the astral plane, they are able to assume any appearance at will, but they undoubtedly have definite forms of their own, or perhaps we should rather say favourite forms, which they wear when they have no special object in taking any other. Of course, under ordinary conditions they are not visible to physical sight at all, but they have the power of making themselves so by materialization when they wish to be seen. There are an immense number of subdivisions or races among them, and individuals of these subdivisions differ in intelligence and disposition precisely as human beings do. The great majority of them apparently prefer to avoid man altogether. His habits and emanations are distasteful to them, and the constant rush of astral currents, set up by his restless, ill-regulated desires, disturbs and annoys them. On the other hand, instances are not wanting in which nature spirits have, as it were, made friends with human beings, and offered them such assistance as lay in their power, as in the well-known stories told of the Scotch brownies or of the fire-lighting fairies mentioned in spiritualistic literature. This helpful attitude, however, is comparatively rare, and in most cases, when they come in contact with man, they either show indifference or dislike, or else take an impish delight in deceiving him and playing childish tricks upon him. Many a story illustrative of this curious characteristic may be found among the village gossip of the peasantry in almost any lonely mountainous district, and anyone who has been in the habit of attending séances for physical phenomena will recollect instances of practical joking and silly, though usually good-natured horseplay, which always indicate the presence of some of the lower orders of the nature spirits. They are greatly assisted in their tricks by the wonderful power which they possess of casting a glamour over those who yield themselves to their influence, so that such victims for the time see and hear only what these fairies impress upon them, exactly as the mesmerized subject sees, hears, feels and believes whatever the magnetizer wishes. The nature spirits, however, have not the mesmerizer's power of dominating the human will, except in the case of quite unusually weak-minded people, or of those who allow themselves to fall in such a condition of helpless terror that their will is temporarily in abeyance. They cannot go beyond deception of the senses, but of that art they are undoubted masters, and cases are not wanting in which they have cast their glamour over a considerable number of people at once. It is by invoking their aid in the exercise of this peculiar power that some of the most wonderful feats of the Indian jugglers are performed, the entire audience being in fact hallucinated, and made to imagine that they see and hear a whole series of events which have not really taken place at all. We might almost look upon the nature spirits as a kind of astral humanity, but for the fact that none of them, not even the highest, possess a permanent reincarnating individuality. Apparently, therefore, one point in which their line of evolution differs from ours is that a much greater proportion of intelligence is developed before permanent individualization takes place. But of the stages through which they have passed, and those through which they have yet to pass, we can know little. The life periods of the different subdivisions vary greatly, some being quite short, others much longer than our human lifetime. We stand so entirely outside such a life as theirs that it is impossible for us to understand much about its conditions, but it appears on the whole to be a simple, joyous, irresponsible kind of existence, much such as a party of happy children might lead among exceptionally favourable physical surroundings. Though tricky and mischievous, they are rarely malicious, unless provoked by some unwarrantable intrusion or annoyance. But as a body, they also partake to some extent of the universal feeling of distrust for man, and they generally seem inclined to resent somewhat the first appearance of a neophyte on the astral plane, so that he usually makes their acquaintance under some unpleasant or terrifying form. If, however, he declines to be frightened by any of their freaks, they soon accept him as a necessary evil, and take no further notice of him, while some among them may even, after a time, become friendly and manifest pleasure on meeting him. Some among the many subdivisions of this class are much less childlike and more dignified than those we have been describing, and it is from these sections that the entities who have sometimes been reverenced under the name of wood gods or local village gods have been drawn. Such entities would be quite sensible of the flattery involved in the reverence shown to them, would enjoy it, and would no doubt be quite ready to do any small service they could in return. The village god is also often an artificial entity, but that variety will be considered in its appropriate place. The adept knows how to make use of the services of the nature spirits when he requires them, but the ordinary magician can obtain their assistance only by processes either of invocation or evocation, that is, either by attracting their attention as a suppliant and making some kind of bargain with them, or by endeavouring to set in motion influences which would compel their obedience. Both methods are extremely undesirable, and the latter is also excessively dangerous, as the operator would arouse a determined hostility, which might prove fatal to him. Needless to say, no one studying occultism under a qualified master would ever be permitted to attempt anything of the kind at all. 4. The Devas. The highest system of evolution connected with this earth, so far as we know, is that of the beings whom Hindus call the Devas, and who have elsewhere been spoken of as angels, sons of God, etc. They may in fact be regarded as a kingdom lying next above humanity, in the same way as humanity in turn lies next above the animal kingdom, but with this important difference, that while for an animal there is no possibility of evolution through any kingdom but the human, man, when he attains a certain high level, finds various paths of advancement opening before him, of which this great Deva evolution is only one. In comparison with the sublime renunciation of the Nirmanakaya, the acceptance of this line of evolution is sometimes spoken of in the books as yielding to the temptation to become a god. But it must not be inferred from this expression that any shadow of blame attaches to the man who makes this choice. The path he selects is not the shortest, but it is nevertheless a very noble one, and if his developed intuition impels him towards it, it is probably the one best suited for his capacities. We must never forget that in spiritual as in physical climbing, it is not everyone who can bear the strain of the steeper path. There may be many for whom what seems the slower way is the only one possible, and we should indeed be unworthy followers of the great teachers if we allowed our ignorance to betray us into the slightest thought of despisal towards those whose choice differs from our own. However confident that ignorance of the difficulties of the future may allow us to feel now, it is impossible for us to tell at this stage what we shall find ourselves able to do when, after many lives of patient striving, we have earned the right to choose our own future, and indeed, even those who yield to the temptation to become gods have a sufficiently glorious career before them, as will presently be seen. To avoid possible misunderstanding, it may be mentioned, par parenthèse, that there is another and entirely evil sense sometimes attached in the books to this phrase of becoming a god, but in that form it certainly could never be any kind of temptation to the developed man, and in any case it is altogether foreign to our present subject. In Oriental literature, this word deva is frequently used vaguely to mean almost any kind of non-human entity, so that it would often include Dhyan Chauhans on the one hand, and nature spirits and artificial elementals on the other. Here, however, its use will be restricted to the magnificent evolution which we are now considering. Though connected with this earth, the Devas are by no means confined to it, for the whole of our present chain of 7 worlds is as one world to them, their evolution being through a grand system of 7 chains. Their hosts have hitherto been recruited chiefly from other humanities in the solar system, some lower and some higher than ours, since but a very small portion of our own has as yet reached the level at which for us it is possible to join them. But it seems certain that some of their very numerous classes have not passed in their upward progress through any humanity at all comparable to ours. It is not possible for us at present to understand very much about them, but it is clear that what may be described as the aim of their evolution is considerably higher than ours. That is to say, while the object of our human evolution is to raise the successful portion of humanity to a certain degree of occult development by the end of the 7th round, the object of the Deva evolution is to raise their foremost rank to a very much higher level in the corresponding period. For them, as for us, a steeper but shorter path to still more sublime heights lies open to earnest endeavour, but what those heights might be in their case we can only conjecture. It is of course only the lower fringe of this august body that need be mentioned in connection with our subject of the astral plane. Their three lower great divisions, beginning from the bottom, are generally called Kama Devas, Rupa Devas, and Arupa Devas, respectively. Just as our ordinary body here, the lowest body possible for us, is the physical, so the ordinary body of a Kama Deva is the astral, so that he stands in somewhat the same position as humanity will do when it reaches planet F, and he, living ordinarily in an astral body, would go out of it to higher spheres in a Maya Virupa, just as we might in an astral body, while to enter the Karana Sharira would be to him, when sufficiently developed, no greater effort than to form a Maya Virupa is to us. In the same way, the Rupa Deva's ordinary body would be the Maya Virupa, since his habitat is on the four lower or Rupa levels of the spiritual state, which we usually call Devachan, while the Arupa Deva belongs to the three higher levels of that plane, and owns no nearer approach to a body than the Karana Sharira. But for Rupa and Arupa Devas to manifest on the astral plane is an occurrence at least as rare as it is for astral entities to materialize on this physical plane, so we need do no more than mention them now. As regards the lowest division, the Kama Devas, it would be quite a mistake to think of all of them as immeasurably superior to ourselves, since some have entered their ranks from a humanity in some respects less advanced than our own. Of course, the general average among them is much higher than among us, for all that is actively or wilfully evil has long been weeded out from their ranks, but they differ widely in disposition, and a really noble, unselfish, spiritually minded man may well stand higher in the scale of evolution than some of them. Their attention can be attracted by certain magical evocations, but the only human will which can dominate theirs is that of a certain high class of adepts. As a rule, they seem scarcely conscious of us on our physical plane, but it does now and then happen that one of them becomes aware of some human difficulty which excites his pity, and he perhaps renders some assistance, just as any of us would try to help an animal that we saw in trouble. But it is well understood among them that any interference in human affairs at the present stage is likely to do far more harm than good. Above the Arupa Devas, there are four other great divisions, and again, above and beyond the Deva kingdom altogether, stand the great hosts of the Dhyan Chohans. But the consideration of such glorified beings would be out of place in an essay on the astral plane. Though we cannot claim them as belonging exactly to any of our classes, this is perhaps the best place in which to mention those wonderful and important beings, the four Devarajas. In this name the word Deva must not, however, be taken in the sense in which we have been using it, for it is not over the Deva kingdom, but over the four elements of earth, water, air, and fire, with their indwelling nature spirits and essences, that these four kings rule. What the evolution has been, through which they rose to their present height of power and wisdom, we cannot tell, save only that it has certainly not passed through anything corresponding to our own humanity. They are often spoken of as the regents of the earth, or angels of the four cardinal points, and the Hindu books call them the Chatur Maharajas, giving their names as Dhritarashtra, Virudaka, Virupaksha, and Vaishravana. In the same books, their hosts are called Gandharvas, Kumbhandas, Nagas, and Yakshas respectively, the points of the compass appropriated to each being in corresponding order east, south, west, and north, and their symbolical colours white, blue, red, and gold. They are mentioned in the secret doctrine as winged globes and fiery wheels, and in the Christian Bible Ezekiel makes a very remarkable attempt at a description of them, in which very similar words are used. References to them are to be found in the symbology of every religion, and they have always been held in the highest reverence as the protectors of mankind. It is they who are the agents of man's karma during his life on earth, and they thus play an extremely important part in human destiny. The Lipika, the great karmic deities of the cosmos, weigh the deeds of each personality when the final separation of its principles takes place in Kamaloka, and give, as it were, the mould of an etheric double exactly suitable to its karma for the man's next birth. But it is the Devarajas who, having command of the elements of which that etheric double must be composed, arrange their proportions so as to fulfil accurately the intention of the Lipika. It is they also who constantly watch all through life to counterbalance the changes perpetually being introduced into man's condition by his own free will and that of those around him, so that no injustice may be done and karma may be accurately worked out, if not in one way, then in another. A learned dissertation upon these marvellous beings will be found in The Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, pages 122 to 126. They are able to take human material forms at will, and several cases are recorded where they have done so. All the higher nature spirits and hosts of artificial elementals act as their agents in the stupendous work they carry out, yet all the threads are in their hands, and the whole responsibility rests upon them alone. It is not often that they manifest upon the astral plane, but when they do, they are certainly the most remarkable of its non-human inhabitants. A student of occultism will not need to be told that as there are 7 great classes both of nature spirits and elemental essence, there must really be 7 and not 4 Devarajas. But outside the circle of initiation little is known, and less may be said of the higher 3. End of Part 4. Part 5 of The Astral Plane by C. W. Ledbetter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Inhabitants continued. 3. Artificial. This, the largest class of astral entities, is also much the most important to man. Being entirely his own creation, it is interrelated with him by the closest karmic bonds, and its action upon him is direct and incessant. It is an enormous inchoate mass of semi-intelligent entities, differing among themselves as human thoughts differ, and practically incapable of anything like classification or arrangement. The only division which can usefully be made is that which distinguishes between the artificial elementals made by the majority of mankind unconsciously, and those made by magicians with definite intent, while we may relegate to a third class the very small number of artificially arranged entities which are not elementals at all. 1. Elementals formed unconsciously. It has already been explained that the elemental essence which surrounds us on every side is in all its numberless varieties singularly susceptible to the influence of human thought. The action of the mere casual wandering thought upon it, causing it to burst into a cloud of rapidly moving evanescent forms, has already been described. We have now to note how it is affected when the human mind formulates a definite purposeful thought or wish. The effect produced is of the most striking nature. The thought seizes upon the plastic essence and moulds it instantly into a living being of appropriate form, a being which, when once thus created, is in no way under the control of its creator, but lives out a life of its own, the length of which is proportionate to the intensity of the thought or wish which called it into existence. It lasts, in fact, just as long as the thought force holds it together. Most people's thoughts are so fleeting and indecisive that the elementals created by them last only a few minutes or a few hours. But an oft-repeated thought, or an earnest wish, will form an elemental whose existence may extend to many days. Since the ordinary man's thoughts refer very largely to himself, the elementals they form remain hovering about him, and constantly tend to provoke a repetition of the idea they represent, instead of forming new elementals, would strengthen the old one and give it a fresh lease of life. A man, therefore, who frequently dwells upon one wish, often forms for himself an astral attendant, which, constantly fed by fresh thought, may haunt him for years, ever gaining more and more strength and influence over him, and it will easily be seen that if the desire be an evil one, the effect upon his moral nature may be of the most disastrous character. Still more pregnant of result for good or evil are man's thoughts about other people, for in that case they hover not about the thinker but about the object of the thought. A kindly thought about any person, or an earnest wish for his good will, form and project towards him a friendly artificial elemental. If the wish be a definite one, as for example that he may recover from some sickness, then the elemental will be a force ever hovering over him to promote his recovery, or to ward off any influence that might tend to hinder it. And in doing this it will display what appears like a very considerable amount of intelligence and adaptability, though really it is simply a force acting along the line of least resistance, pressing steadily in one direction all the time, and taking advantage of any channel that it can find, just as the water in a cistern would in a moment find the one open pipe among a dozen closed ones, and proceed to empty itself through that. If the wish be merely an indefinite one for his general good, the elemental essence in its wonderful plasticity will respond exactly to that less distinct idea also, and the creature formed will expend its force in the direction of whatever action for the man's advantage comes most readily to hand. Of course, in all cases the amount of such force it has to expend, and the length of time that it will live to expend it, depend entirely upon the strength of the original wish or thought which gave it birth. Though it must be remembered that it can be, as it were, fed and strengthened, and its life period protracted by other good wishes or friendly thoughts projected in the same direction. Furthermore, it appears to be actuated, like most other beings, by an instinctive desire to prolong its life, and thus reacts on its creator as a force constantly tending to provoke the renewal of the feeling which called it into existence. It also influences, in a similar manner, others with whom it comes into contact, though its rapport with them is naturally not so perfect. All that has been said as to the effects of good wishes and friendly thoughts is also true in the opposite direction of evil wishes and angry thoughts. And considering the amount of envy, hatred, malice, and all uncharitableness that exists in the world, it will be readily understood that among the artificial elementals many terrible creatures are to be seen. A man whose thoughts or desires are spiteful, brutal, sensual, avaricious, moves through the world, carrying with him everywhere a pestiferous atmosphere of his own, peopled with the loathsome beings he has created to be his companions, and thus is not only in sadly evil case himself, but is a dangerous nuisance to his fellow men, subjecting all who have the misfortune to come into contact with him to the risk of moral contagion from the influence of the abominations with which he chooses to surround himself. A feeling of envious or jealous hatred towards another person will send an evil elemental to hover over him and seek for a weak point through which it can operate. And if the feeling be a persistent one, such a creature may be continually nourished by it, and thereby enabled to protract its undesirable activity for a very long period. It can, however, produce no effect upon the person towards whom it is directed, unless he has himself some tendency which it can foster, some fulcrum for its lever, as it were. From the aura of a man of pure thought and good life, all such influences at once rebound, finding nothing upon which they can fasten, and in that case, by a very curious law, they react in all their force upon their original creator. In him, by the hypothesis, they find a very congenial sphere of action, and thus the karma of his evil wish works itself out at once by means of the very entity which he himself has called into existence. It occasionally happens, however, that an artificial elemental of this description is for various reasons unable to expend its force either upon its object or its creator, and in such cases it becomes a kind of wandering demon, readily attracted by any person who indulges feelings similar to that which gave it birth, and equally prepared either to stimulate such feelings in him for the sake of the strength it may gain for them, or to pour out its store of evil influence upon him through any opening which he may offer it. If it is sufficiently powerful to seize upon and inhabit some passing shell, it frequently does so, as the possession of such a temporary home enables it to husband its dreadful resources more carefully. In this form it may manifest through a medium, and by masquerading as some well-known friend, may sometimes obtain an influence over people upon whom it would otherwise have little hold. What has been written above will serve to enforce the statement already made as to the importance of maintaining a strict control over our thoughts. Many a well-meaning man who is scrupulously careful to do his duty towards his neighbour in word and deed is apt to consider that his thoughts at least are nobody's business but his own, and so lets them run riot in various directions, utterly unconscious of the swarms of baleful creatures he is launching upon the world. To such a man, an accurate comprehension of the effect of thought and desire in producing artificial elementals would come as a horrifying revelation. On the other hand, it would be the greatest consolation to many devoted and grateful souls who are oppressed with the feeling that they are unable to do anything in return for the kindness lavished upon them by their benefactors. For friendly thoughts and earnest good wishes are as easily and as effectually formulated by the poorest as by the richest, and it is within the power of almost any man, if he will take the trouble, to maintain what is practically a good angel always at the side of the brother or sister, the friend or the child whom he loves best, no matter in what part of the world he may be. Many a time a mother's loving thoughts and prayers have formed themselves into an angel guardian for the child, and except in the almost impossible case that the child had in him no instinctive response to a good influence, have undoubtedly given him assistance and protection. Such guardians may often be seen by clairvoyant vision, and there have even been cases where one of them has had sufficient strength to materialize, and become for the moment visible to physical sight. A curious fact which deserves mention here is that even after the passage of the mother into the devachanic condition, the love which she pours out upon the children she thinks of as surrounding her will react upon the real children still living in this world, and will often support the guardian elemental which she created while on earth, until her dear ones themselves pass away in turn. As Madame Blavatsky remarks, her love will always be felt by the children in the flesh. It will manifest in their dreams, and often in various events, in providential protections and escapes. For love is a strong shield, and is not limited by space or time. Key to Theosophy, page 150. All the stories of the intervention of guardian angels must not, however, be attributed to the action of artificial elementals, for in many cases such angels have been the souls of either living or recently departed human beings, and they have also occasionally, though rarely, been devas. This power of an earnest desire, especially if frequently repeated, to create an active elemental which ever presses forcefully in the direction of its own fulfilment, is the scientific explanation of what devout but unphilosophical people describe as answers to prayer. There are occasions, though at present these are rare, when the karma of the person so praying is such as to permit of assistance being directly rendered to him by an adept or his pupil, and there is also the still rarer possibility of the intervention of a deva or some friendly nature spirit. But in all these cases the easiest and most obvious form for such assistance to take would be the strengthening and the intelligent direction of the elemental already formed by the wish. A very curious and instructive instance of the extreme persistence of these artificial elementals under favourable circumstances came under the notice of one of our investigators quite recently. All readers of the literature of such subjects are aware that many of our ancient families are supposed to have associated with them a traditional death warning, a phenomenon of one kind or another which foretells, usually some days beforehand, the approaching decease of the head of the house. A picturesque example of this is the well-known story of the white bird of the Oxenhams, whose appearance has ever since the time of Queen Elizabeth been recognised as a sure presage of the death of some member of the family, while another is the spectral coach which is reported to drive up to the door of a certain castle in the north, when a similar calamity is impending. A phenomenon of this order occurs in connection with the family of one of our members, but it is of a much commoner and less striking type than either of the above, consisting only of a solemn and impressive strain of dirge-like music, which is heard apparently floating in the air 3 days before the death takes place. Our member, having himself twice heard this mystic sound, finding its warning in both cases quite accurate, and knowing also that according to family tradition the same thing had been happening for several centuries, set himself to seek by occult methods for the cause underlying so strange a phenomenon. The result was unexpected but interesting. It appeared that somewhere in the 12th century the head of the family went to the Crusades, like many another valiant man, and took with him to win his spurs in the sacred cause his youngest and favourite son, a promising youth whose success in life was the dearest wish of his father's heart. Unhappily, however, the young man was killed in battle, and the father was plunged into the depths of despair, lamenting not only the loss of his son, but still more the fact that he was cut off so suddenly in the full flush of careless, and not altogether blameless youth. So poignant indeed were the old man's feelings, that he cast off his knightly armour and joined one of the great monastic orders, vowing to devote all the remainder of his life to prayer, first for the soul of his son, and secondly, that henceforward no descendant of his might ever again encounter what seemed to his simple and pious mind the terrible danger of meeting death unprepared. Day after day for many a year he poured all the energy of his soul into the channel of that one intense wish, firmly believing that somehow or other the result he so earnestly desired would be brought about. A student of occultism will have little difficulty in deciding what would be the effect of such a definite and long-continued stream of thought. Our knightly monk created an artificial elemental of immense power and resourcefulness for its own particular object, and accumulated within it a store of force which would enable it to carry out his wishes for an indefinite period. An elemental is a perfect storage battery, one from which there is practically no leakage, and when we remember what its original strength must have been, and how comparatively rarely it would be called upon to put it forth, we shall
Okay, I'm gonna start all over again. Not on the stream, but on the subject matter. I'm just gonna start going. This reminds me of CW Chandra when he does the hand things. Except it's like a female warlock version of the hoodie. Today's topic is going to be on my thoughts on death gods, death goddesses, on demons, manipulation, protection, cursing, dark justice. Do I think curses are okay? How do I destroy enemies? Herbology, the wonders of botanicals. How do I make oils? A travel spell, and simple candle magic. But today's main topic is going to be centered around death, planetary magic, and dark things, because today's Saturday, and during a waning moon, Saturday on a waning moon is the perfect day to do Chris. I hope you can hear me well, because I've never done this with headphones. Where did it go? I was just on it. Tell me if you can hear me well, please. I don't see the chat yet. If I'm luring, I'm dying. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Greatest. It's awesome you're always at my shows. Thank you. Okay. I don't know what the first subject I'm going to go on. It's probably going to be about death gods like I've listed. I'm going to notes. This one death god. Another death god. That's different god. I just use pictures because if I had to buy a statue for every god I worked with, that would probably be like $1,000. Which isn't bad, it's just too many fucking spirits want to look at me. Get out of here, fractal anus. You fractured your anus. What are you booing at? What are you booing at? What are you booing at? What are you... That's not a CW quote. You quit making fun of that poor old man. Spaghetti. I'm teaching magic too, but we don't care. I'm just kidding. Last time I didn't have any notes. I never have notes, but this time I do. No, not notes, but subject topics. I have the Santa Muerte. I love her. She's the only one I'm working with.